Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Red Path. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about my games at the Las Vegas Open 2023. So grab yourselves a brew and let's dive in. Okay, welcome back everyone. So, by now, a lot of you are probably aware that myself and Jamie both attended the Las Vegas Open. And it was an incredible event. We had an awful lot of fun. You'll have already seen that we have a small little battle report between the two of us up on the channel, and we've got lots of different videos coming up in the next few days about the event, how we found it, the social aspect of it, meeting everyone, all that good stuff. But the most important thing to probably most people watching is, how did the games go? So we played 6 games over 2 days, which was pretty intense. It was grueling at times, an awful lot of fun at the same time though. And overall, the experience was actually much better than I had expected it to be. Being completely honest, I went to the event not very excited, because we were living in that strange world of Arcs of Omen was out, but it wasn't yet legal. We had a codex release right on the horizon, and I was finding it difficult to motivate myself to actually want to play with our old rules and the old mission pack. Nevertheless, once I got to the event and we started playing some warm-up games in the house the day before, I suddenly got very excited to play again. So the army that I brought, if you don't know already, is identical to the one I brought to the Coventry GT last November, which is composed of a Demon Prince, a Dark Apostle, 2 5-man Berserker squads, 1 8-man Berserker squad, 2 10-man Cultist squads. Then in the elite slot, this is where we have the real meat and potatoes, we have 8 Red Butchers with a Black Rune of Damnation. We have 8 Chosen with Combi Bolters and Accursed Weapons. We have 6 Possessed, and a Master of Executions, who I gave the Hatred Incarnate Warlord trait to. Moving on from there, we have our transports, which is 2 Drills, 1 with Volkite, 1 with Flamers, and a Rhino. So the list basically revolves around 3 hammer units in the forms of the large Berserker squad, the Chosen squad, and the Terminators, and basically picking the right time to engage with them. The Demon Prince has the Mantle of Traders as well, so he can kind of bounce the buffs out to all those core units and things like that. So this functions pretty simply, it's a Ronseal list, as Jamie loves to say, but it works well, and it means that I can focus on making the important decisions in the game rather than having to worry about the complexity of my list. Now, I went 3 wins and 3 losses with this list, which was slightly better than expected. I had anticipated going 2 wins and 4 losses. And we're going to talk about the games next. I'll go into a bit more detail about them, but just to summarize, my game 1 was against Tyranids. I played Kraken mids. I lost that game, narrowly, but I lost it. After that, I played into Chaos Knights, which I won in a fairly decisive victory. Then I played Aeldari, which I also beat fairly decisively. Then we went into day 2. I played Tyranids first, and I lost them quite badly. And I played Tyranids again after that, which I lost to again. And finally, I finished off the event playing Grey Knights with a Thunderhawk gunship, which was, you just can't compare to that sort of energy. So those were the wins and the losses, interesting games all in all, and we're going to talk about them a little bit more. So that's coming up next. All right, welcome back everyone. Let's dive into the discussion of the games. So my first game, unfortunately I drew Tyranids, and as you will see as we go in, Tyranids seem to be my kryptonite for this event, which will shock no one considering how potent they were at the given that they were basically unnerfed at this stage. But I was playing into a good old Kraken Nids list, and it's kind of everything that you would expect from a Kraken Nids list these days. So an awful lot of Raveners, there was a big warrior blob, there was actually 2 Hive Tyrants, one with Shard Gullet and one with the Reaper of Obliterax. There was a nice unit of Zone Thropes, which we all know and love so well. There was actually a Spore Assist for bombing the board with Spore Mines, along with 2 Biovores, a Pyrovore, and some other good stuff. But you know, it was kind of the same core that we've seen in an awful lot of Kraken mid lists, which is extremely brutal, fast Raveners, and supported by just horrific Tyranid monsters. So I took some interesting secondaries here. We took the Long War, we took Banners, and we took Skulls for the Skull Throne. Now, Skulls might seem like an unusual pick here, but it's actually quite nice because I put it on the Flying Hive Tyrant with the Reaper of Obliterax. So the reason for this is it often, in my experience, makes the Tyranid player very nervous and kind of apprehensive about bringing the Reaper Flyrant into play, because if they fail to kill their target, they won't be able to overrun back, meaning that they're open for a hit from Skulls for the Skull Throne. So it's kind of a weird pick, but it made sense at the time. And we were playing Recover the Relics. So essentially what happened was we both put two of the big runes kind of central enough on the board and used them as staging points. And I started off the game playing really cagey. I set up pretty much my entire army inside this large rune, ready to jump out when the opportunity presented itself. And I had some guys, you know, running upfield doing banners and things like that. One of my drills I also kept in reserve. So he presented the bait first. He moved an awful lot of harpies into the middle of the board, or not harpies, excuse me, gargoyles. To kind of just, you know, be like, okay, what are you going to give me for this? And he also moved a pyrovore down in the bottom corner of kind of my deployment zone area, which was, I think, a mistake on his part. Because essentially what happened is I used that pyrovore as a speed booster, essentially charged my whole army into it, and then using Kill Me and Burn, I slingshotted my Red Butchers with a double activation, giving them an 18-inch move, so they were able to just really reach into his deployment zone pretty deep on. The Gargoyles were picked up by a squad of Berserkers and Possessed, which were then kind of like up in the top half of the board, hanging out, having a pretty good time. At this point, I'd obviously committed an awful lot of force pretty early in the game, but I was well positioned across the board, put it like that. So he kind of answered back in a pretty heavy way, bringing out an awful lot of the Raveners. He jumped out Death Leaper and the Venom Tropes as well, which have a really annoying combination of fights first and fights last, and a whole other host of annoying rules that were problematic for combat armies. So he had a pretty strong hit back, picking up several of my key units. He did have to put a squad of Tyrant Guard, a squad of Raveners, and a squad of Warriors all into the Red Butchers, and still fails to actually kill the entire unit, which was pretty amusing. So the game kind of went on from there in a interesting kind of back and forth trade. One of my drills came up, did a lot of work. The Berserker squad stayed inside there for a while, and I was kind of like trading out every other turn with Chosen, with the remaining Red Butchers. The Possessed hung around for a while, but you know, towards the late game I started to run out of resources as the Reaper of Obliterax Flyrant was introduced into the game. Now at this point my Demon Prince was held up in the bottom of the board fighting the other Hive Tyrant, so I actually had to engage the Flyrant with a 8-man Berserker squad, and I put two different strats on them. I put extra AP, and I put the 6s to hit auto wound. Sorry, I didn't put extra AP. It was extra strength that I put on them. So they managed to bring the Flyrant down to 1 wound, which was quite annoying because I really needed to get those 10 points for skulls. And hilariously, in his turn, he went to fall back with the Flyrant, and I used Cut Them Down, 1 CP stratagem, rolled a 1/6, did the last mortal wound, the Flyrant died, so I did manage to scrape 5 points from that. But yeah, at this point I was really running out of resources, but so was he. We kind of effectively almost tabled each other, and I had the bottom of turn scoring, so that was looking quite nice in my favor. However, I'm not going to get into it too much, but there was an awkward moment towards the end of the game where my Demon Prince wanted to fall back from his Venom Tropes, essentially, and he said I couldn't do that because they have a rule that means you can't fall back. However, I kind of argued that, like, I was pretty sure that's not how it worked because I was a monster and had fly. But, you know, he was saying that was how it worked, and I'm not perfectly familiar with the Nids Codex, so I was like, okay, that's fine. One thing led to another, and there was a bit of a disagreement, essentially, and he ended up going back 2 turns so he could roll for a fight last on the Demon Prince that he hadn't done. in order to do a single mortal wound from the Venom Thrope's ability so that I would actually end up dying and wouldn't be able to fall back and score primary on the last point. At this point, it was a little bit awkward, but we were very late in the round. The TOs were looking for our score, and I was kind of like, look, if you want to win that bad, that's perfectly fine. I don't really care that much, and it's not going to swing the game in my favor anyway. So that was it. The game ended 93-71 to the Tyranids, which, is perfectly fine. Tyranids are Tyranids. They're kind of a stupid army that has a lot of stupid rules and are not always the most fun to play against. And look, I'm pretty happy that they are getting nerfed. However, Pedro played a pretty tight game. His movement was very good. He understood how to trade out well against a lot of my key units, utilized a lot of his key units to kind of get efficient battles going for himself. And in the end, he deserved the win and he got it. So that was game one. A very interesting game. I was glad that I brought it as close as I did. And yeah, overall interesting, I would say. So game two is coming up next. All right, game two was against the fantastic Chaos Knights. This was a really interesting Chaos Knight list. It was 3 big boys and a few war dogs hanging around the place as well. So there was the unkillable Knight Abominant, there was a Megara, and there was a Rampager. As well as that, I think there was 4 Armigers, as far as I can recall. And yeah, it was a pretty fun one. I kind of think that World Leaders have a pretty good matchup into Chaos Knights. And this game was over pretty quickly for some of those reasons. So I managed to go first and I got a squad of Possessed into one of his Armigers with an Apoplectic Frenzy move, and they were able to tear it down and actually pile in to an Armiger behind and end up trapping it. So it wasn't going to be able to fall back in the next turn, which was pretty nice. So that set me up quite nicely for the first turn, and the game kind of went on from there. There was a central objective in this mission, and there was an awful lot of fighting over it, as I kind of put an awful lot of bodies on the objective pretty early. The Red Butchers, which were fully buffed up, and, the Chosen were there as well. So he sent the Rampager up forwards. The Chosen and the Rampager had a bit of a battle. Rampager killed 4 of them. I brought the Rampager down to, I think, 12 wounds. The Megara was kind of hanging around, putting shots into the Red Butchers, not really doing a whole lot. And the Abominant was lurking in the back with the remaining Armigers. So he was quite passive in actually coming out and fighting my army, which was fair enough because you don't really want to get into the guys too early. But I was kind of racking up an awful lot of primary points as the game was going on. So his hand was a little bit forced in one sense, and he had to push the Megara and the Rampager up, especially when a drill came in his backlines. Now, I did fail the initial charges with the drill, and the Master of Executions swapped out, which was fine, because in the next turn, the drill withstood a full round of shooting from the Knights and proceeded to charge the unkillable Knight Abominant alongside the Master of Executions and a Berserker squad. And the drill alone did 33 damage to it, as I had 2 6s to hit, explode into extra hits with Wanton Slaughter, which was absolutely horrific. Now, the Abominant did pass enough feel no pains to actually live on a handful of wounds, but he was swiftly finished off by the Master of Executions and the Berserkers. So at this point, the Abominant had gone down, the Rampager had gone down, and it was looking pretty bleak for the Chaos Knights, to be honest. So he actually charged the Megara into the Red Butchers, which I did tell him not to do, but he didn't really have much of a choice, and it didn't go well. The Megara did not kill any of the Red Butchers, and the Red Butchers kills the Megara in response. So by the bottom of battle round, or I think it was top of battle round 4, he had 1 Armiger left on the table, which I killed pretty quickly, and that was it. So it was pretty brutal. I won that game by a significant margin, and I think it just highlights that Chaos Knights have a very difficult time into World Leaders, because you can have these units that turn off rerolls that are transhuman to hit, but the weight and quality of attacks that World Leaders have really just tend to push through, especially if you're rocking Knights that don't have an invulnerable save in combat. Like my Chosen at AP4 in the charge were going straight through. The drills were going straight through, no saves required, just putting out massive amounts of damage. So, I think it was a fairly brutal game that highlighted just how devastating the World Leaders can be when they get into combat with targets that they actually want to fight. especially when those targets don't necessarily have the resources that they need to hit back in an effective way. So I was feeling pretty good after that game. It was really fun. Nice back and forth with the opponent. You know, he was as shocked as I was when the drill did 33 damage, but you know, sometimes the dice roll in your favor, and this was one of those cases. So that was pretty fun. Game 2 ended good comprehensive victory. That'll be game 3 coming up next. Okay, so game 3, the last game of day 1 was against Travis and his Inari. So I haven't actually, or up until this point, I hadn't played against Inari, and I had some PTSD from playing against them in 8th edition with the teleporting Incarn being quite problematic. So I was a little bit worried about this one, especially when I saw that there were Swooping Hawks on the list, which are they're my trauma unit. I hate Swooping Hawks deeply with a passion. But it was an interesting list. I took Skulls for the Skull Throne against his Skyrunner. I took Abhor the Witch because he had a lot of Wraith Seers, he had the Incarn, and he had the Farseer. So lots of Psychers rocking around the place. And then I took the Long War because it was Data Scry Salvage, and that is my favorite mission. And you kind of have to flip the objectives in order to actually win the game. So that was pretty fun. He had a Falcon in his list which was full of Howling Banshees, amongst other things. And he got first. So turn 1 started off with the Howling Banshees dropping out of the Falcon, charging into a cultist squad, a Hemlock flying up and doing a psychic power bomb kind of effect into pretty much my entire army, and a squad of Striking Scorpions hitting my Possessed. So unfortunately Barney and co were very quickly minced by the Howling Banshees, and the Striking Scorpions were actually only able to bring down 2 of the Possessed and died in response on the hit back. So it was a pretty interesting first turn, and I think essentially that play from him more or less lost him the game straight away, because he presented 3 units to me in the first turn that I could slingshot my whole army across the board with. So most of my army charged into the Howling Banshees or the Falcon, and some of them still kind of like milled around the bottom of the Hemlock, and my Demon Prince was hanging out there in case he needed to charge it. My drill actually shot the Hemlock to death, which was pretty surprising, but you know, Abhor points, and then the rest of my army effectively butchered the Falcon and the Howling Banshees and slingshotted all across the board. So I was on 3 of the midpoints in turn 1, already racking up a lot of Data Scry Salvage points, which was really good. And the game kind of went on from there. It was really interesting. You know, he pushed back in a good way, moving up his Wraith Seers and things like that to kind of contest the objectives, but the reality of the situation was I had gotten such a strong position in turn 1 that there was no way he could really come back from that, especially on Data Scry Salvage, because he didn't really have the resources to leave someone on the home field objective to do the actions while still contesting all the midfield objectives that I was on. He did drop in a Wave Serpent full of Howling Banshees on one objective, but I kind of countered that with the Red Butchers. The Chosen did an awful lot of work in this game, dragging down a Wraith Seer, the remaining Possessed dragged down the other Wraith Seer. So very, very quickly it was going in my favor up until, hilariously, the Farseer rocked up and killed my Demon Prince in combat, denying me Skulls for the Skull Throne in the coolest, most Eldar of ways, where I imagine he had foreseen his fate at the hands of the Demon Prince and countered it. However, Hateful Mo hopped out of the drill in the next turn and butchered the Farseer, who promptly resurrected thanks to the Phoenix Gem, and then tried to quicken away in the Psychic phase, and Mo of course rolled a 4 up on the Scourge of Sorcery, meaning the Farseer was still stuck there, and Mo just killed him again, getting me 10 points in Skulls for the Skull Throne. So it was a pretty funny game because I was able to play exactly the game that I wanted to, basically continuously trading on midfield objectives. And Data Scry Salvage just really lends itself to being able to play that sort of game and playstyle very, very easily, just with the nature of the mission and the objective layout. So it finished in a very comprehensive victory. It was 91-47 to me. And yeah, I was very happy with my performance in that game. I thought I played quite a tight game. The Incarn was teleporting around a little bit, but I sort of positioned in such a way that If any squads were lifted up, the Ian Cairn couldn't actually teleport there because the area that it was teleporting into was too small. Eventually I did manage to kill it with a squad of Berserkers after it had run through my drill. So that was nice. The final power points were kind of secured and the game was mine in the bag. So that was the end of game 3. At that point I was 2-1, finishing day 1 on a high and moving into day 2. So game 4 is coming up. So game 4 was against a very interesting High Fleet Behemoth Tyranids list, which didn't have a lot of the things that you were used to seeing. Now it did have 2 big warrior bricks, which I suppose was a bit more common. However, it had an awful lot of gene stealers. It had 9 mucilid spores, more venom tropes, the Swarm Lord, Tyranid Prime, and a host of other unusual units that I frankly was not very used to seeing on the Tyranids list. Now, it was piloted by an incredibly good player. I will say that I've not played many people as skilled as my opponent in this round. And he played an excellent game of putting a massive amount of pressure on me in the early turns and forcing my hand in a lot of ways. So one thing he did that was really good was there was a magic box in the middle of this table which he filled with Tyranid Warriors, Gene Stealers, and then on the outside had the Swarm Lord, a bunch of mucilid spores, and a bunch of venom tropes. The Swarm Lord was my the Sculptor target in this game. So he presented all this to me pretty early in the game. I think it was his turn too, and I answered it thinking that if I could get rid of the venom tropes, I would have an avenue with which I could actually charge the Swarm Lord and kill him pretty easily. Unfortunately, I was not able to kill the venom tropes with all my shooting. They had a 2-up save and cover thanks to their adaptive physiology, and I was just not able to lift them. So unfortunately, I was faced with a pretty brutal choice of charging my chosen squad into 3 mucilid spores so that I could clear the way. Which, you know, they did and suffered an awful lot of mortal wounds. And then I failed 2 charges, one with my Red Butchers and one with my Demon Prince. So after all that heroic sacrifice, I was not even able to reach the Swarm Lord, which pretty early on kind of sealed the deal on the game. Over in one corner, the Possess were fighting a bunch of Tyrant Guard for what felt like an age, as neither squad was able to kill the other, which was pretty amusing. And a bunch of Gene Stealers charged into my Dark Apostle, which he hilariously lived through. So the game was very funny in the sense that a lot of unusual things were happening, but I was very quickly getting tabled, essentially. So, you know, went after the Swarm Lord, kept going for it. I was blocked at every occasion, and then 6 mucilid spores flew over and blew up in front of my Red Butchers and did 24 mortal wounds to them, which was really rough. And there wasn't really much I could do after that because my entire Red Butcher unit was just lifted right in front of me. And yeah, that was it pretty much. That game was savage, it was brutal, it was hilarious. My opponent, he was a really good support. You know, he tried to give me points in the end by charging the Swarm Lord into my Termite Drill for Skull Throne, but I was just unable to kill the Swarm Lord no matter how hard I tried. So it was a very comprehensive victory. For the Tyranids, it was 97-33, I believe. I haven't been beaten that badly in a game in quite an amount of time, but I would say it was down to a combination of very funny dice, but ultimately player skill on my opponent's part. He was an incredible player, he moved perfectly, he did exactly what he needed to do to force my hand, and it paid off. So that was the end of game 4. So we'll move on to game 5, that's coming up next. Okay, so after getting hammered by High Fleet Behemoth, I ended up into High Fleet Jormungandr? I think it was Jormungandr or Gorgon, I can't remember. Either way, I had paired Creations of Bile, which I thought was going to be quite an interesting game, and then FLG decided they needed to do a repairing, and I repaired into Tyranids. So this was my 3rd game against the Nids, and to be completely honest, by this time I was kind of getting pretty bored of playing against Tyranids. Now this list was, on the face of it, quite interesting. It was Old One Eye and I think somewhere in the region of 10 Carnifexes of mixed varieties. So, you know, I thought this was going to be a pretty fun and potentially not too bad of a game for me to win, because on paper my list should beat this. Now, I'm not going to get too much into the game, but it wasn't very fun. And I thought it was pretty crazy that no one was running Carnifexes if they were weapon skill 2 rerolling 1s in the combat phase. And since they could fight on death even after interrupting in combat, and a host of other things that, you know, I just couldn't really understand why there wasn't more people running Carnifexes if that was their stats. Until I found out in the game afterwards that that just wasn't their stats. They're not weapon skill 2. They don't have 14 attacks each on the charge. They don't reroll once to hit. They can't fight on death. And a host of other things. So that was a little bit awkward. I don't really want to say too much more about it, but once I found out everything, I was kind of annoyed. Some pretty big feel bads in that game. Now I try to be as honest as possible in, in making these videos and in kind of telling people how my games were and stuff. And being completely honest, it was not a fun game. And that was that. I lost the game. It was 86-55, but I should have won it. And that kind of stings a little bit, especially when, you're kind of coming up towards your last game. However, if I would have won it, I wouldn't have gotten to play my last opponent, which was Luke, and that was my favorite game of the tournament. So let's wrap this more uncomfortable game up and talk about what was undoubtedly one of my best tournament games of all time. So that's coming up next. So it's game 6. It's the last game of the LVO, and I am currently 2 wins and 3 losses with a lot to prove, because Jamie's also on 2 wins and 3 losses, and I know I can't finish worse than him or I'll never hear the end of it. So I see that I'm playing into Grey Knights, and I don't even look at the list. I just see Grey Knights and I'm kind of like, okay, this should hopefully be fine. We'll see what happens. I was pretty tired at this point and, had a bad taste in my mouth from the previous game. But I rock up to the table and, it had gone around all weekend that there was someone who had brought a Thunderhawk gunship to the LVO, and it was my opponent Luke. So this was just one of the most awesome games that I've ever played in 40k, because Luke was so hype. He was really, really into the narrative of the game, the fact that we're playing on an orc board. It's World Leaders versus Grey Knights, so it's basically Armageddon. And it was just so exciting. His whole army started inside the Thunderhawk, and very quickly we realized that there was pretty much nothing I could do about that Thunderhawk, since I had effectively no guns and a single unit with fly. So it flew up in the first turn, it pumped a load of shots into one of my drills, took it down to 1 wound or something like that, and he kind of just put it there and said, alright, come at me. And I did. I charged my Demon Prince in, he dodged Overwatch left and right as he flew through the sky. I did some wounds to it, but obviously was never going to be able to kill a Thunderhawk gunship in combat. So in the next turn, Luke's entire army fell out of this plane into the middle of the board, which was hilarious. And he charged a lot in that turn. He charged into a whole bunch of units, including my Chosen. He avoided my Possessed, and he charged into my Red Butchers, which, I was kind of telling him maybe, it's not the best call to go into the Red Butchers. They're very hard to kill. But he went for it anyway, and I admired his courage. Meanwhile, the Thunderhawk flew into my backlines and absolutely immolated Barney and the cultists, who were just hanging out in an objective trying to raise a banner. So the combat went well for him at the start. He picked up all my Chosen, and then it didn't go well when he didn't kill any Red Butchers, and they killed the entire strike squad back. And effectively, from there, it was kind of the Red Butchers' show. They tore through his entire army in the subsequent turns. They just picked up Grey Knights left and right, and there was very little he could do about it. The Terminator Librarian teleported in and did a bunch of mortal wounds, which killed off an awful lot of my Possessed, but I had just gained way too much momentum, and there was nothing he could do when the Red Butchers were just hammering into his lines and, absolutely tearing out his characters, getting me loads and loads of abhor points. However, the Thunderhawk did drop down into hover mode, and the Tech Marine, which was my Sculpture the Skullthrone target, had actually teleported, or had been teleported next to it. So it was kind of off in a corner of the board, which I wasn't really able to access until I popped one of my drills up and made an amazing 10-inch charge with my 8-man Berserker squad into the Tech Marine. And I went for a charge with my Termite drill into the Thunderhawk gunship, which was killed in Overwatch, which was just the funniest thing ever. And you know what? It serves my drill right for doing 33 damage to a Night Abominant in an earlier game. So it was pretty awesome. By the end of the game, he had just the Thunderhawk left, but it was flying around, shooting the crap out of my army. And yeah, it was just hilarious. Like, Luke's energy was outstanding. He was a fantastic sport, even when his army was getting torn to shreds. He was so animated about the the story of this like Grey Knight's army last stand and everything, and he really brought me into the spirit of the game after having such a rough previous round. And honestly, I think he saved my tournament in a lot of ways. Not because I won. The outcome of the game is irrelevant. It was just the fun that we had during the game. We were both screaming and roaring. There was blood for the blood god being let out at various intervals. There was so much energy in that game, and it really helped me finish the LVO on a high. So yeah, that was the last game, finishing me out 3-3. So let's do the wrap up. That's coming up next. So when the dust had settled, I finished out the LVO with 3 wins and 3 losses. I was pleased, to be honest. There was a moment where I saw the 4-2 opportunity and it went to my head, but alas, it was not to be. And given that I had had basically no practice going into this event, I hadn't played 40k for essentially 2 months, I thought I did pretty okay. Overall, it was enjoyable. You know, there was a couple of bumpy moments, but in general, my opponents were incredible people that played very tight games of Warhammer. I will say that I think I was actually better than almost all my opponents. My opponent who played High Fleet Behemoth, he was definitely better than me. But the other games that I lost were, I think, a lot of it down to the fact that the Nids Codex just is that strong into the World Leaders. But, you know, it is what it is. They're getting nerfed, we're getting a new buff. So we'll have to see how things are going to go in the future. It'll be really interesting. Overall, me and Jamie are probably going to dive into it in a separate video, but I did not enjoy player place terrain. I thought some of the boards were really rough and difficult to play around. But for the most part, I didn't really have many complaints about the event, and I was happy with how I did. So it was tons of fun. It was a good way to send off the old Chaos Space Marine book, I think, and look forward to the new World Leaders Codex, which is coming out very, very soon, and we're going to have a whole bunch of content on that. So if you want any more info about my games or how I did or the list or anything like that, feel free to check out our Discord, hop in there and get the conversation going, where, you know, we're always happy to engage and chat away. But yeah, that was it from the LVO from me. We're going to have Jamie's games coming up later this week, as well as some of our thoughts on the event in general, and a very, very special review on the Red Path RTT, which happened on the Sunday. All that's coming up in videos to come, folks. So until then, you stay healthy, stay safe, and kill, maim, burn.